What happens when a quiet black teenager boards a first-class flight, and everything about him, his clothes, his silence, his skin makes the crew believe he doesn't belong? What if the seat was his? The ticket was real, and the only thing wrong was the way people looked at him. And what if after being slapped, humiliated, and pushed to the back of the plane, he didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't even cry? He just typed one message, and the moment that text left his phone, an entire industry shook. Who was this young man? Why did a single slap ripple across boardrooms, classrooms, and homes around the world? And how did a seat, just a regular airplane seat, become a symbol for something so much deeper? This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about dignity, stillness, and a boy who made the world listen without raising his voice. Get ready for a journey. 36,000 feet above the ground and far deeper into the heart of who we are. If this story stirs something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Now, let's begin. The early morning air at McCarran International Airport carried that sterile mix of jet fuel, overused carpet, and burnt espresso. Business travelers in tailored suits hustled past gate C-18 phones pressed to their ears, voices flat with urgency. Children yawned and clutched stuffed animals. Mothers tugged suitcases, and announcements echoed every few minutes like the background hum of a machine too big to question. No one noticed the 17-year-old boy stepping through the gate. Elias Monroe didn't expect them to. He never did. He walked steadily, shoulders relaxed beneath a navy blue hoodie. His jeans were clean, but a little faded at the knees. On his back, he carried a weathered leather satchel, the kind that looked like it had stories stitched into its seams. His sneakers, white once, now softened by time whispered across the carpet. His boarding pass, printed on slightly crinkled paper, read Seat 2A First Class Atlantic Crest, Air RC418 Las Vegas to Boston. He didn't hesitate. He walked through the priority boarding lane when called, scanning the room with a quiet, practiced awareness. He didn't shrink. He didn't boast. He just existed. And somehow, that was enough to make people uncomfortable. The first-class cabin was pristine in a way that tried too hard. White leather seats, gold-toned reading lamps, flight attendants with frozen smiles. Elias stepped into it like someone stepping onto a stage built for another kind of actor. He reached up, slid his satchel into the overhead bin above seat 2A, and sat by the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, and the plane's wing caught the orange light like it had been dipped in fire. He liked window seats. He liked silence. He liked being surrounded by sky. He pulled out his book, James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, and rested it gently in his lap. Then he leaned back, wrapped his hands loosely around the pages, and let himself disappear into the words. Except he never really disappeared, not in spaces like these. A white man in seat 2B adjusted his Rolex and kept stealing glances at Elias while pretending to check market updates on his phone. A woman across the aisle blinked twice, lips slightly parted as if her eyes needed time to adjust to the image of someone like Elias in this section of the plane. No one said a word. They didn't need to. In first class, silence was the sharpest form of communication. Elias wasn't unfamiliar with it. The long pauses in conversation when he entered a room, the subtle check of credentials, the compliments laced with surprise. "You're so articulate you read Baldwin good for you," his father once told him. Sometimes they won't say you don't belong, they'll just make you feel like you've trespassed. So he didn't meet their eyes. He turned the page, let his thumb brush the underlined words. You know, and I know, that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom. 100 years too soon. The sound of heels struck the carpet like a drumbeat of decision. Marla Denton, lead flight attendant, had entered the cabin. She was tall, trim, in her early 40s, with her sandy blonde hair wound into a severe knot. Her uniform was a spotless tailored navy blazer, gold wings pinned precisely over her heart. Her expression was professional, but her gaze was a scalpel. She moved like someone who had memorized the choreography of authority. As she greeted the ruse, her eyes scanned passengers not with warmth, but with quiet assessment who belonged, who didn't, who might cause delay, who might demand compensation. Then her eyes landed on Elias. They stopped, not out of confusion, not curiosity, but confirmation. Her smile didn't falter, but her posture shifted slightly, like her spine had straightened into something colder. She passed him by at first, as if nothing was amiss. But then, a moment later, she returned. "Excuse me," she said in a voice polished smooth. "Are you certain you're in the correct seat?" Elias looked up, not startled, not defensive, just calm. "Yes, 2A. Her smile stayed, but her eyebrows tightened. "I see. May I see your boarding pass?" "Please." Elias pulled the paper from his hoodie pocket, unfolded it slowly, and handed it over with 2 fingers. She took it without thanking him. Eyes darted between the code, the name, and then his face. There it was, that pause, that silent calculation. She gave a tight nod, returned the ticket, and added with a little tilt of her head, "Traveling alone today?" "Yes," Elias replied, then gently returned to his book. Marla didn't move, not right away. Something about his composure made her uneasy. She had expected nerves. She had expected uncertainty. But this boy, this young black boy in first class, gave her none of that. And that, somehow, felt like a challenge. She walked away, but the moment didn't pass. The man with the Rolex gave a glance that said, "Huh." The woman across the aisle checked her compact mirror, though her eyes flicked toward Elias's reflection. It was subtle, yet obvious. The tension had entered the cabin, not through raised voices, but through a question and unspoken accusation. Elias could feel it, in his chest, in his gut. He turned another page of Baldwin, but the words blurred slightly. He had done everything right, so why did it feel like he was already on trial? He closed the book softly, leaned his head back, closed his eyes. He didn't know it yet, but this flight wasn't going to take off on time. Not because of weather, not because of fuel, because one person had chosen suspicion over procedure, and someone else was about to answer for it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as final boarding was announced. Elias Monroe kept his gaze on the oval window. The tarmac shimmered in the early desert sunlight. Waves of heat rising off the concrete like breath from something ancient and restless. Baggage carts zipped past, and in the distance, the neon echo of Las Vegas blinked a sleepy farewell. Inside the plane, silence was doing something else entirely. It wasn't peaceful, it was alert. Elias could feel it in his skin, the way one might feel a room full of eyes even when no one is talking. He didn't need to look around to know he was being watched, but he looked anyway. Across the aisle, the woman in 1D, The one with the silk scarf and the stiff posture wasn't reading the newspaper she held. Her eyes hovered just above the fold, aimed in his direction. When she noticed him looking, she blinked quickly and turned the page with exaggerated grace. Seat 2B. The man with the Rolex and hair that was clearly dyed too dark for his age was tapping his phone screen like it owed him money. He wasn't doing much but toggling between his email and the stock app, but his peripheral vision was hard at work. Behind him, a couple spoke in low tones, pausing whenever Elias shifted. Their silence wasn't hateful, but it wasn't innocent. It was the silence of calculation. Why is he here? Is that a buddy pass? Maybe he snuck up. The questions didn't need to be asked out loud to ring loud in Elias's ears. He had grown used to this particular frequency of doubt. He pulled the book closer, ran his fingers along the folded corner of the page he'd left off on. James Baldwin still waited patiently, but Elias couldn't quite fall back into the words. His mind was no longer at peace. In his chest, something began to flicker. Not anger, not quiet. Something older, something heavier. He'd felt it before. Walking through department stores with his mother, hearing the click of a security guard's shoes as they trailed behind them. He'd felt it in classrooms when teachers mistook quiet for disinterest. He'd felt it in elevators, in scholarship interviews, in the too long stares of white classmates' parents. The assumption that he must explain himself before he even speaks. He shifted in his seat. "Hey," a voice came from behind him. "Excuse me." Elias turned. A young flight attendant stood in the aisle. Her badge read Layla Stone, and she looked no older than her late 20s. She had kind eyes, but unsure ones. "I just wanted to offer you some orange juice or water before takeoff," she said softly. "We'll begin service after we're in the air, but if there's anything now." He nodded, trying to smile. "Water's fine." She poured it, handed it to him, and hesitated. Then said, "You're reading?" Baldwin Elias glanced down at the book and gave a polite nod. "Yeah." Her smile grew a little more real. "I read If Beale Street Could Talk last semester. That's a good one." She lingered half a second too long, as if debating whether to say something else, then glanced behind her toward the galley and quickly walked away. Elias sipped the water. The exchange had been normal, almost comforting, but even Layla's hesitation said something. Said she had seen what had happened earlier, said she noticed, and that she wasn't sure if she was allowed to speak on it. He wasn't mad at her. In a way, he understood her silence more than he liked to admit. A few minutes passed. The final passenger boarded. The cabin doors closed. Captain Dale Conroy's voice crackled gently over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Atlantic Crest Air Flight RC-488 with service from Las Vegas to Boston. Flight time today is just over 4 hours. We'll be taking off shortly. Flight crew, please prepare the cabin." Click. Elias buckled his seatbelt and rested his head briefly against the leather headrest. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. His father, no doubt, checking in. He didn't look, not yet. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. His fingers tapped once against the book's back cover. In the front galley, Marla Denton watched the seatbelt sign flicker on and off with clinical precision. She didn't feel tense. Not yet. But there was an odd tightness at the base of her neck that hadn't been there earlier. She replayed the earlier interaction in her mind. The boy, the hoodie, The way he'd looked her directly in the eyes without flinching. It wasn't defiance, exactly, but it was unsettling. It had been a long time since a passenger had made her second guess herself. She wasn't used to doubt. She was used to order, used to people complying, and something about that boy had made her feel watched, evaluated, as if he were seeing through the smile she wore like a badge. She didn't like that feeling. It made her wonder if she'd missed something. As the plane began to back from the gate, a soft rumble filled the cabin. Elias closed his eyes again, but only for a moment. His mind drifted back not far, just 2 hours earlier when he'd hugged his father goodbye in the curbside drop-off lane. Be aware, not afraid, Graham Monroe had said, gripping Elias's shoulder. And don't let them shake you. You belong wherever you walk. Elias had nodded, but he hadn't really believed it. He wanted to, but that weight, that invisible weight, it was already settling on him like the pressurized air of the cabin. He opened his eyes and his phone and reread the boarding pass in his hand. Seat 2A. There was no mistake. So why did everyone around him look like they were waiting for one? The plane taxied slowly, the low hum of its engines filling the cabin like an impatient breath being held. First class remained quiet, as always, soft murmurs between executives, the rustling of newspapers, and fingers gliding silently across screens. But beneath that polished hush, something had shifted. Elias Monroe felt it in the space between his book and the window. He didn't need to look up to know someone was walking toward him. He recognized the rhythm of those heels now, deliberate, certain, sharp like punctuation. Marla Denton stopped in the aisle beside his seat. She didn't smile this time. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice smooth but taut. "I'm going to need to verify your ticket again." Elias blinked once, slowly, then turned to face her. "You already did," he replied, voice low but clear. She didn't flinch. "Yes, but there's been some confusion, just a formality. No one else was asked twice," Elias said evenly. Marla straightened, brushing the hem of her blazer with one hand. "This won't take a moment." The man in 2B suddenly became very interested in the overhead light. The woman in 1D pulled her scarf tighter. Elias reached into his hoodie pocket, removed the slightly crumpled boarding pass, and held it out. Marla took it between two fingers, not rudely but without warmth. She stared at it longer than necessary. Seat 2A. Elias Monroe, Atlantic Crest Air. No irregularities. Still, she hesitated. Then, as if trying to prove something to someone herself, perhaps she tilted her head. "Are you sure this wasn't a last-minute upgrade?" Elias blinked. "No. It was booked 2 weeks ago. Paid in full. By whom myself." Marla's expression hardened ever so slightly. "Really, yes," Elias said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't narrow his eyes. He simply let the words sit in the air like a verdict. That calm unsettled her. She had expected confusion, maybe even defensiveness. Instead, she got clarity. She hated that. Passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. A businessman 2 rows ahead stopped scrolling. The older woman across the aisle paused mid-sip of her latte. They all watched, but no one spoke. Marla handed the ticket back with a clipped motion. "Fine. Then we'll verify through the system." Elias tilted his head. "Is that what you do for every passenger in 2A?" Marla paused for a half-second too long. "That's not the point. It is for me," he said. And then it happened. She reached past him suddenly, without asking, to grab the phone resting near his elbow, whether she meant to or not. Her hand caught his in the motion. There was a sharp, unmistakable slap, not a full strike, not an intentional act of violence, but loud, jarring, undeniable. The cabin fell into an even deeper silence, one so total it rang. Elias's hand recoiled. He looked down at it, then up at her. In 3C, a man gripped his seat's armrest. In 4F, a young woman lowered her phone just as she had instinctively lifted it to record. No one said a word, but everyone felt the breach. Marla stood still, her fingers twitching, realization beginning to dawn, but pride refusing to let her retreat. "I was verifying your information," she said tightly. "You struck me," Elias said. "It wasn't intentional, but it happened." Their voices didn't rise. That made it worse. It wasn't loud. It was loud enough. He stood up slowly, not in protest, not in a hurry, just stood. He picked up his satchel from the overhead compartment, slung it across his shoulder. Marla said nothing. Her jaw tightened. Elias turned toward the aisle and began walking toward the back of the plane. Row after row of passengers parted their eyes but not their lips. He didn't glance left or right. He walked with the calm of someone who'd already lived this moment before. He didn't demand, didn't argue, didn't ask for a seat reassignment. He just kept moving until he reached the last row by the lavatory. The seat was stiff. The back didn't recline. It smelled faintly of bleach and loneliness. He sat. Back in the first-class galley, Marla stood motionless. One hand braced against the wall, the other clenching the edge of the service counter. She felt the heat rising in her face. Not from guilt, from something else. Something like fear. In the cockpit, Captain Dale Conroy glanced at the secure message that had just appeared on the comms display. His co-pilot looked over his shoulder, eyebrows furrowing. It read, "Do not close cabin doors. Hold position. Executive directive. Immediate review requested re-passenger in 2A." Captain Conroy frowned. In 30 years of flying across continents, he had never received a message like that. It wasn't a safety check. It was something higher, something personal. Elias sat still. He looked out at the tarmac again, the same as before. But something had shifted, inside the plane, inside the people, and quietly, painfully inside himself. His phone buzzed softly again. This time, he looked Graham Monroe. "Dad." The message read, "Is everything all right? You haven't taken off yet." Elias stared at the screen, then typed back a single line. "She slapped my hand and sent me to the back." He hit send, then turned off the screen, and waited. At first, the silence after the slap seemed like any other pause in a flight, the kind that settles in between announcements or right before the plane lifts off. But this silence was different. It had gravity. It pulled everything into it, the whispers, the glances, the guilt. No one moved. No one spoke. In seat 3C, Richard Langley, the finance executive with the expensive tie and louder opinions, sat frozen. Earlier, he had turned away from the exchange between Elias and the flight attendant, telling himself it wasn't his place, but now he could still hear the sound. That slap, That skin-on-skin contact that wasn't supposed to happen. Not there, not in first class, not in silence. He looked at his hands. They were clenched, not in anger, but in shame. Near the rear of the cabin, Elias leaned his head against the hard plastic wall next to the restroom door. The smell of disinfectant was thick. His seat vibrated slightly from the engine's idle. He didn't cry. He didn't fidget. He just was. But inside everything was moving, a storm of questions. Why did I let her touch my phone? Why did no one say anything? Why do I always have to be the one who stays calm? His fingers hovered near his phone, but he didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he breathed deeply. And for a moment, he wasn't on a plane at all. He was 12 years old again, in the back seat of his dad's car, his father saying, "You don't always get to control how they treat you. But you do control how much of yourself they take with them." That had stayed with him. So now, he sat up, he tapped a new message to his father. She slapped my hand and sent me to the back. No one said a word. Then he locked the screen. Nothing else. No punctuation. No anger. Just truth. In the cockpit, Captain Dale Conroy reread the executive message, "Hold RC-418 at gate. Subject Elias Monroe. No departure until contact with CEO office." He didn't know who Elias Monroe was yet, but it didn't take long. His co-pilot, flipping through the digital manifest, glanced up. Passenger 2A, Monroe, Elias. Wait, Monroe, as in Graham. Monroe. Captain Conroy's head lifted slowly, as in CEO Graham Monroe. The two pilots exchanged looks. Captain Conroy picked up the interphone. "Cabin to front," he said. Seconds later, Marla Denton's voice came through. "Yes, Captain, I need you in the cockpit." "Why? What's wrong?" His voice tightened. "Just come up. Now." Marla straightened her uniform jacket with unnecessary precision. She could feel eyes on her, though none of them were bold enough to meet hers. She passed through the rows like nothing had happened, though the sting of tension was sharper than any turbulence. When she stepped into the cockpit, the light changed, cooler, harsher. The cockpit wasn't made for theater, it was made for control. "Captain," she asked, blinking against the screen glow. Captain Conroy turned, face grave. "Marla, do you know who Elias Monroe is?" She didn't answer immediately. The name registered, but the pieces hadn't yet come together. Then it clicked. Her lips parted slightly. "I didn't realize." "Well, now you do," Conroy said. "And the directive is to hold this flight until executive instructions are cleared. We are not taking off. She started. You touched a passenger without permission. In front of a full cabin." He interrupted. "And that passenger is the son of the man who owns 40% of this airline." Marla felt the world constrict, and for the first time in years, she had nothing to say. In first class, Layla Stone stood near the front galley, watching the passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. She held a pot of coffee in one hand, but she wasn't pouring. She was remembering. That moment when she saw Marla reach across Elias, that sharp sound, and how she had frozen, like everyone else. She swallowed hard. She had always told herself she wasn't part of the problem, that she wasn't like the others, that staying quiet wasn't the same as doing harm. But now, she felt different. Now, she felt implicated. She placed the coffee pot back in its holder and slowly walked to the rear cabin. Elias didn't look up when she arrived. Layla stood beside his row for a few seconds before speaking. "I saw what happened." He turned his head slightly. "I should have said something." She continued. "I didn't, and I'm sorry." Elias met her eyes for the first time. His expression was unreadable. "I don't need an apology," he said quietly. "I need someone to say something when it counts." Layla nodded. She looked down at her shoes. "You're right." Elias looked back out the window. "Then say it," he murmured. Layla blinked. What to the rest of them? He didn't say it with malice. He said it like a challenge, a request, a test. She stood there a few seconds longer, then turned away and began walking forward, her pulse racing, her hands sweating, but something else now pushing her forward. Up in the PR department of Atlantic Crest Airlines headquarters, Graham Monroe stared at the message on his phone from his son. The room around him buzzed executives debating numbers, analysts reviewing social media metrics, but none of that mattered right now. He placed his phone on the table and picked up the secure company line. The next call would be to the flight, and the fallout, that was just beginning, in a glass-walled executive suite 32 stories above Manhattan. Graham Monroe stared through his own reflection, watching the city below blink and pulse like a motherboard. Behind him, the PR director was still talking, and if this reaches the press before we do, it could derail the entire equity meeting with the European partners. "We have to control the narrative stop," Graham said, softly but firmly. The room silenced. He picked up his phone again. There it was, still glowing. She slapped my hand and sent me to the back. No one said a word. No exclamation marks. No drama. Just that quiet, deliberate tone. The tone of his son. The tone of truth. Graham didn't ask for further details. He didn't doubt his son. He just opened his corporate contact list and dialed the one line that superseded all flight chains. At Portland International Airport, the control tower received the directive under highest protocol, level red. The tower dispatcher didn't question it, didn't hesitate. She immediately notified the gate control supervisor, who in turn activated a light signal on flight RC-418's departure screen, hold position, executive intervention, in the cockpit. Captain Dale Conroy stared at the blinking signal. This wasn't a technical failure. This was a reckoning. He knew at the moment the second call came direct, encrypted, flashing the executive seal of the airline's founder. He picked up the receiver. "Conroy," he said. The voice that responded was deep, controlled, and quiet as thunder held behind glass. "This is Graham Monroe. Captain, do not let that plane leave." Conroy straightened. "Understood. I want a full cabin freeze. No taxi, no liftoff. Secure the cockpit. I'm dispatching Richard Lane personally. ETA 11 minutes. I want that crew held until further review." "Yes, sir." Click. Conroy exhaled and turned to his co-pilot. "Lock us down." In the first-class cabin, tension had begun to solidify into whispers. Passengers shifted. Some glanced at their watches. Others looked toward the flight attendants, expecting reassurance, expecting a reason. They received none, because Marla Denton, head flight attendant, was sitting in the jump seat, her posture unusually stiff. She had not spoken to anyone since the cockpit call. Even her colleagues noticed, especially Layla Stone, who now hovered by the curtain, struggling between her role and her conscience. The intercom buzzed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received a hold from Central Operations. We'll remain at the gate for a short while. Please remain seated. We appreciate your patience. The announcement was neutral, but the mood wasn't. At the rear of the plane, Elias looked down at his phone again. Still no new messages, still silence. But now it was a different kind of silence, not the shameful stillness of people pretending they didn't hear. This was the silence that came before something broke open. A tap on his shoulder made him look up. It was Layla. She crouched down to eye level. "I need to say something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just to you." Elias didn't respond. She stood and turned, walking toward the front of the cabin. Passengers watched as Layla stepped into the aisle and stopped near seat 2A. She took a shaky breath, then lifted the intercom. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the PA button. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a member of the cabin crew on this flight. My name is Layla Stone." She paused, eyes turned, phones tilted upward. "I've been working in this job for 3 years, and I've never seen a passenger move from their seat in first class after showing a valid ticket until today." The silence in the cabin now had a pulse. Layla inhaled. "I saw a young man removed from seat 2A. I saw him treated with suspicion, then struck without raising his voice, without causing any disruption, and I did nothing." Passengers blinked. The woman in seat 1D lowered her scarf. The man in 3C dropped his eyes. "I didn't speak up," Layla said, voice cracking. "But I'm speaking now, because silence is complicity, and I refuse to stay silent any longer." She let go of the intercom, and for the first time since boarding, there was a sound in the cabin not caused by machinery, a deep, collective breath. In the cockpit, Conroy's headset crackled again. "Approaching," said a voice from gate control. "Who is Conroy?" asked. "Executive Transport," confirmed Richard Lane. Conroy turned to the first officer, opened the door for him, and prepped the log for suspension procedures. 2 minutes later, Richard Lane, the COO of Atlantic Crest, stepped into the aircraft, tailored gray suit, burgundy tie, white hair combed perfectly. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't make eye contact with the passengers. He walked straight to the cockpit, knocked twice, and was let in. Marla saw him, and her fingers turned white from clutching the seatbelt straps. She knew. In the cockpit, Lane stood over the manifest screen. "She removed him from 2A, he asked flatly. Conroy nodded, and now he's in 39F. Lane didn't respond immediately. Then bring her here. The cockpit of Flight RC-418, usually a sanctuary of focus and control, had become a courtroom. Richard Lane stood near the avionics panel like a judge about to hand down a sentence. The narrow space felt tighter than usual, the oxygen thinner, no lights blinked, no alarms sounded, and yet the tension in the air rang louder than a stall warning. Captain Conroy stood to the side, his arms crossed, as if distancing himself from the scene unfolding. Marla Denton stepped in, her posture still firm, but her eyes, once cold and commanding, now blinked with uncertainty. "Marla," Richard began, his tone even but unmistakably loaded. "Do you know who you removed from seat 2A?" Her mouth opened, closed. She was trained to answer with confidence, but her training had failed her. "I wasn't sure. She finally said, "That's not what I asked." She paused. "Elias Monroe, son of Graham Monroe," Richard added, "CEO of this airline, your employer." Silence. "You didn't check the manifest. You didn't confirm his boarding pass. You removed him because he didn't match your expectations of what someone in that seat should look like." Marla's shoulders tensed. "That's not save it," Richard cut in, voice sharper now. "You didn't follow protocol. You escalated a non-incident. And then, in front of an entire cabin, you laid hands on a passenger. It wasn't intentional, but it was done." Outside the cockpit, a ripple of whispers moved through the cabin. Passengers had seen Marla walk in. They hadn't seen her come out. Layla Stone, seated now in the forward galley, clenched her hands in her lap. She had spoken. The cabin had heard her. Now they were watching to see if her words had consequences. In 2B, Richard Langley opened his phone again. The corporate site for Atlantic Crest had begun trending. Posts were popping up faster than he could scroll. One tweet stood out. The boy in seat 2A never raised his voice. But somehow the whole airline is now listening. He closed the screen, and for the first time in years, he questioned what kind of leader he truly was. Back in the cockpit, Marla tried again. "I didn't mean to single him out." Richard's tone dropped. "But you did. And you've been in this job long enough to know what that means. I thought I was protecting the cabin. From what Marla blinked, from a passenger who didn't match the booking, and what part of his behavior justified suspicion." Another pause. He wore a hoodie, carried no luggage. He didn't. He didn't look like someone in first class. And there it was. Not shouted, not snarled, just admitted, raw, unvarnished. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You judged him based on appearance, and that appearance made you uncomfortable enough to violate every protocol we teach our staff. Marla opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Down in the main cabin, Elias remained in seat 39F. The chair was stiff, the leg room cramped. His phone vibrated again. "We've grounded the flight. Lane is on board. Sit tight, Dad." He stared at the screen, then typed, "I don't want revenge, I want it to mean something," and sent it. At the same time, Richard Lane exited the cockpit. His steps were slow, not because he was tired, but because he understood that every eye was on him. He stopped near the aisle by row 1 and addressed the passengers directly. "My name is Richard Lane," he said, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Atlantic Crest." Silence followed. Earlier today, a passenger was wrongfully removed from his seat. Protocols were not followed, and worse, bias replaced process. People glanced around, unsure whether to nod or stay still. He had a valid ticket. He posed no threat, and yet he was judged not for his behavior, but for what someone assumed he couldn't afford to be. He paused. "We are investigating the incident, and this flight will not take off until a formal correction is made." Then, calmly, he turned to Layla. "Please go to the rear cabin and escort Mr. Elias Monroe back to seat 2A." The aisle became a gauntlet again, but this time, Elias didn't walk it alone. Layla walked beside him, no longer a silent attendant, but someone doing what should have been done hours ago. Passengers watched, but now their silence wasn't cold, it was reverent. Elias moved with the same quiet strength he always had, but now every step felt different. He passed Langley in 2B. Langley met his eyes and nodded. Apology, recognition, and humility all wordless. In 4F, a woman raised her phone but didn't film. She placed it face down on her tray table. Some things didn't need to be recorded. They needed to be remembered. When Elias reached seat 2A, it had been cleaned again. Someone had tucked the seat belt neatly to the side. A glass of water waited for him. He sat down slowly, looked around, then nodded once to Layla. "Thank you." She bowed her head slightly. "You deserved better from all of us." And with that, she returned to her post. As Elias turned back to the window, the early sunlight had shifted. Now it poured through the glass, striking across his lap like a spotlight. But this wasn't the stage. It was a moment, earned, restored, and finally witnessed. The cabin of Flight RC-418, once blanketed in polite avoidance, now held something far heavier than discomfort reflection. Not a word had been spoken by Elias Monroe since returning to seat 2A. His hands rested gently on his lap. His eyes remained on the oval window, but the silence no longer isolated him. Now it surrounded everyone else. It pressed on them. It asked something of them. And slowly, one by one, they began to answer. Seat 3D. An older woman with silver-gray curls and wire-rimmed glasses sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had spent the earlier part of the flight reading a memoir on justice. Now the pages lay flat, untouched. She stood up, not quickly, not dramatically, just with quiet dignity. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice a little hoarse. "I saw it all, and I said nothing. Heads turned, not in judgment this time, in witness. I thought it wasn't my place. I thought, like so many of us probably did, that someone else would say something, that staying quiet wasn't the same as agreeing." She looked directly at Elias, but I was wrong. Silence is agreement, even if it's polite, even if it's dressed in fear. She sat back down, placing her hand over her chest, and this time she didn't avert her eyes. Seat 4A. A middle-aged man in a charcoal blazer. Peter Hale, corporate attorney from San Francisco, removed his glasses. He cleaned them methodically before speaking. "I'm a lawyer," he said, "and I pride myself on fairness. But even I looked at him and thought, maybe he's in the wrong seat." He paused, voice tightening, and I realize now that thought came not from reason but bias. I assumed. I made a mental shortcut, the kind we never admit, but always carry. He turned toward Elias. "I'm sorry, and I intend to do better, not just here, everywhere." The voices began to multiply, not loud, not boastful, but raw, vulnerable. "Seat 5C. A woman whispered. I told myself he must have done something wrong. "Seat 7A. A man murmured. I had my phone out to record, not to help, just to watch. "Seat 8F. A teenage girl blinked back tears, her voice shaky. You were so calm, and it scared me because I wasn't." In the rear cabin, Layla Stone leaned against the galley wall, listening to each confession like a wave washing away the polished surface she had lived behind. She remembered the training. Smile, follow procedure, de-escalate, but no one had ever trained her how to recognize quiet cruelty, the kind that looked like policy but felt like something else. Her notebook was still tucked in her apron pocket. She pulled it out and wrote, "Silence isn't safe." It's just invisible harm. Near the front of the plane, Richard Langley stared forward, eyes glassy. He wasn't the kind of man who got emotional. He negotiated mergers worth billions. He could survive boardroom politics. But now he was being negotiated with by his conscience. He stood up, unbuttoned his jacket, and walked to Elias's seat. "I'm Richard," he said, extending a hand. "Earlier, I pretended I didn't see what happened." Elias looked at him for a moment, then slowly shook his hand. "You don't need to apologize," Elias said, voice low, "but you can remember?" Langley nodded. "I will. I already do." In the flight deck, Captain Dale Conroy listened through the intercom as passenger after passenger spoke. His co-pilot looked over. "You ever heard anything like this?" the younger man asked. "No," Conroy said. "And I've been flying since before 9/11. Should we report it?" Conroy shook his head. "There's nothing to report. It's not a disturbance." He leaned forward. "It's a reckoning." In seat 39F, now empty, a single boarding pass lay folded on the armrest. A child near the aisle stared at it. Her mother noticed. That's where he had to sit. The girl nodded, even though he had a real ticket. Yes, the girl said. They thought he didn't belong. The mother looked at the seat, then back at her daughter. "Do you think he did?" The girl didn't hesitate. He never left. They just put him in the wrong place. Back in 2A, Elias finally turned from the window. He looked around, not just at the passengers, but at their faces. They were different now, less guarded, more real. A woman mouthed, "Thank you." A man nodded. The silence had changed shape. It no longer excluded. It now bore witness. At Atlantic Crest HQ, a young communications aide rushed into the executive conference room. "Sir," she said, breathless, to Graham Monroe, "there's something you need to see." She pulled up a live feed inside the plane. A passenger had turned on their phone not to go viral, but to document what healing looked like. One voice, then another, then dozens. Graham didn't speak. He just watched, and smiled not because the problem was over, but because the conversation had finally begun. It started as a 12-second clip. No music, no filter, no voiceover. Just a grainy video showing a flight attendant's hand swiping down across a young man's hand, followed by the stunned stillness that settled over the first-class cabin. The camera didn't shake. It didn't need to. It captured something clearer than outrage the moment silence took form. The boy, Elias Monroe, stood up, quietly gathered his things, and walked down the aisle. He never raised his voice, never pleaded, never argued, but the image of him leaving seat 2A became an earthquake in motion. 40 minutes after the flight was grounded, the video hit Twitter, posted by a woman in seat 4F, no caption, no hashtags, just the raw footage and a line he didn't say a word. And that's what makes this louder. By the time flight RC-418 was cleared for takeoff again, the video had 3.1 million views. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, it was playing on TV screens across terminals in Atlanta, Chicago, and LAX. In a Brooklyn cafe, a barista paused the espresso machine. "Yo, have you seen this?" he asked his coworker, spinning the screen around. In a dorm room in Texas, a first-year law student replayed the clip, her fingers trembling. "He didn't do anything," she whispered. And in a suburban kitchen in Ohio, a mother of 3 watched it with her youngest son beside her. The boy looked up at her. Why did they make him move? The mother had no answer, only tears. Newsrooms exploded. CNN sent out a push alert, airline under fire after video shows black teen removed from first class. Despite valid ticket, BBC followed U.S. airline faces reckoning over racial profiling incident mid-flight. Even Al Jazeera ran a headline, "Silent Passenger." Loud impact, teen's ejection from first class goes viral. Back inside the cabin of Flight RC-418, the air shifted. Passengers began receiving texts, emails, calls. Their own faces appeared on Twitter threads, TikTok breakdowns, Instagram reels. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were part of the story. Seat 3B. A businessman scrolled and saw himself in the video looking away as Elias stood up. He paused, then closed his laptop and whispered to himself, "No more pretending I didn't see." Seat 5D. A college-aged woman opened her TikTok app and watched her own quiet gasp looped beneath a text overlay. And still. They said nothing. She dropped her phone, not out of shame, but realization. In the cockpit, Captain Dale Conroy received a transmission from ground control, a new instruction: maintain current altitude and patch in secure video from HQ. CEO to speak directly. The cabin crew scrambled, monitors flipped, and then Graham Monroe's face filled the central cabin screen. He didn't use titles, didn't speak like a CEO, he spoke like a father. My son, Elias, was removed from his seat today. He didn't misbehave, he didn't break protocol, he simply didn't match what someone expected to see in seat 2A. He paused, looking straight into the lens. I'm not speaking to you today as the head of Atlantic Crest. I'm speaking as a man who has witnessed too many moments like this go unspoken. The cabin held its breath. If a young black man, silent and respectful, can still be seen as suspicious, what does that say about the lens we're looking through? In a high school in Baltimore, a teacher streamed the speech live to her social justice class. Her students, all seated in silence, watched the man on screen not demand action, but invite accountability. In a church in Detroit, a pastor paused his sermon. "This is what conviction without fury looks like," he said, gesturing to the clip playing on a parishioner's phone. Back on the plane, Elias Monroe finally looked away from the window. He took a breath and checked his phone. There were over 400 unread messages, journalists, friends, former classmates, activists, politicians, even a senator. He scrolled slowly. One message stood out from a middle school teacher he hadn't heard from in years. "Elias, you were quiet even in 7th grade, but I always knew that stillness had power. Today, the world knows it too." He closed his eyes, and for the first time since boarding, he smiled. Not because the pain was over, but because it had finally been seen. In the rear galley, Layla Stone leaned against the wall, staring at the cabin screen. The CEO's voice continued. "If we are to lead this industry, we must unlearn the reflex to judge and relearn the instinct to listen." My son did not shout, but his silence has shaken the foundation of our values. And then, from this day forward, seat 2A will no longer be just a seat. It will be a reminder that someone's presence should never need to be explained. The plane soared through clear skies. The seatbelt signs remained off, but no one moved. They sat not as travelers, but as witnesses to a moment, a reckoning that began with a slap and became a movement. The door to the forward galley clicked open with a mechanical sigh. The hush in the first-class cabin deepened, like the moment before thunder splits the sky. Marla Denton stepped through, but she didn't walk like she used to, not with the brisk, polished confidence of a senior flight attendant who believed the cabin bent to her presence. Now, every step was measured, every blink deliberate, every breath forced through the thick air of consequence. Her eyes swept across the seated passengers. For the first time in her 22-year career, they didn't look away. They didn't pretend she was invisible. They watched her, not with hatred, but with expectation. Elias Monroe sat in seat 2A. His posture hadn't changed, still upright, still composed, still silent. But when Marla's shadow fell over the aisle beside him, he turned and met her eyes. She flinched, not visibly, but enough for her voice to falter as she began. "Mr. Monroe." The title sounded foreign to her own ears, not because it wasn't deserved, but because she'd never used it before. Not when she'd looked at him and seen anything but Elias, she corrected herself. Her throat tightened. He said nothing. She continued, I'm here to offer a formal apology, not just on behalf of the airline, but from me." A murmur passed through the rows behind her. Marla didn't blink. "I was wrong," she said. That part came easier than she expected, because she had finally stopped trying to avoid it. "I saw you. I doubted you. I acted on that doubt. Not policy, not protocol, just bias." The word hit the cabin like a gust of air. A few heads turned. Someone in 3A exhaled. Marla pressed on. "I didn't ask for your boarding pass because of procedure. I asked because I didn't expect someone like you to belong in that seat." Her hands were clasped now in front of her, tight enough that her knuckles turned white. "I slapped your hand when you tried to protect your phone. I tried to cover it with authority. I tried to justify it with assumptions. But the truth is, none of that makes what I did right." She took a breath, not to clear her guilt, but to find the courage to finish. "You didn't raise your voice. But what you didn't say told the whole cabin, and now the whole world, everything they needed to know." Elias still didn't speak, but his stillness had weight, and that weight filled the air between them. "I want to ask for your forgiveness," Marla said, "but I understand that's not mine to request. What I owe, what we owe, is change." In the back cabin, Layla Stone stood just outside the galley, listening. Her fingers rested on the wall. She couldn't see Marla's face, but she could feel the tremor in her voice. And for the first time, Layla didn't see her as just the woman who had made a mistake. She saw someone trying not to run from it. Passengers leaned forward, listening not because of curiosity, but because they knew they were witnessing a moment of accountability, not spectacle. And in seat 4C, a middle-aged woman who had filmed the original video sat with tears in her eyes. She had nearly deleted the video earlier, but now she was grateful she hadn't. Not because of the views, but because without it, this might never have happened. Marla shifted slightly. Her voice cracked. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I don't deserve that. But if I can be part of the change we need, if I can help this crew, this company, this industry see where we failed, then maybe this seat, this apology, can be more than just words." She lowered her gaze for the first time. "I'm sorry. Elias." The cabin was still. No one clapped, no one cheered, but everyone felt something shift. Elias finally turned toward her fully. His voice, when it came, was quiet but sure. "You looked at me," he said, "and decided I didn't belong." The same words he had spoken earlier in front of the cabin. But this time, they weren't an indictment. They were a mirror. Marla nodded, eyes watering. "I know." Elias continued, "You thought being polite made it okay, but it wasn't politeness. It was power." She swallowed hard. "Yes." And now Marla straightened, not defensively, but intentionally. "Now, I'm listening." He looked at her for a long moment, and then, without permission or performance, Elias gave her what she hadn't expected. Not a smile, not forgiveness, but a chance. He simply nodded, not in approval, but in acknowledgement that she had chosen to face the weight of her actions in front of the same eyes that had once watched in silence, and this time they saw her. At the back of the plane, Captain Conroy watched from the galley screen, his hands behind his back, a lump in his throat. He'd flown thousands of flights, weathered hurricanes, emergency landings, system outages. But this was the most turbulent correction he had ever witnessed. And somehow, it was also the most hopeful. In Atlantic Crest HQ, the PR office prepared a statement, not a press release, not a defense, but a broadcast of Marla's apology, verbatim, with no edits. It would be streamed with Elias's permission, and the company wouldn't label it damage control. They would call it what it was, restoration. They said he was too quiet, too young, too unassuming, but now Elias Monroe's silence had become a megaphone heard around the world, not because he shouted, but because he didn't, and still he made them all listen. 2 hours after Flight RC-418 landed at Denver International Airport, footage of Marla Denton's public apology was streamed live on the Atlantic Crest homepage. No flashy transitions, no background music, just raw footage from the plane's in-flight cabin camera. A woman in uniform. A boy in Seat 2A. A moment unfolding with all the uncomfortable honesty America rarely aired in daylight. By the next morning, the clip had surpassed 12 million views. In a Los Angeles high school, students crowded into a social studies class earlier than usual. Their teacher had posted a sign on the board, "We're not discussing the civil rights movement today. We're watching one happen in real time." At a Chicago terminal, flight attendants huddled near Gate 22, watching on a tablet as Marla's voice played. "I asked because I didn't expect someone like you to belong in that seat." One attendant, Priya, placed a hand over her mouth. Another, Marcus, whispered, "I've done that." Not a slap, but the doubt. They didn't speak again for a while. They just listened. Inside the training wing of Atlantic Crest's headquarters, a large whiteboard had been wheeled into the central hallway. On it, someone had written in black marker, "Seat 2A is now more than a seat. It's a mirror." Below it, a basket of sticky notes waited. Employees began writing on them, one by one. I judged silently. I won't anymore. I'll check my bias before I check a ticket. Listening is the new policy. My silence used to protect me. Now I see it protects the problem. By the end of the day, the board was full, not of slogans, but of promises. Meanwhile, Elias Monroe sat alone in a corner conference room of Carter and Monroe Holdings, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea. He scrolled through hundreds of unread emails, some from high schools, some from corporate DEI departments, some from parents, teachers, pilots, and then one message from a name he didn't expect. Subject, may I speak with you from Bridget Sanders, former Atlantic Crest flight leader. The message was only one paragraph long. I watched your return to 2A. I cried, not out of shame, but because I never thought to listen to someone I couldn't imagine in that seat. May I speak with you? Not to fix the past, just to understand the present. Elias stared at the screen for a long time, then closed the laptop without replying. Across the country, local unions of flight attendants began holding emergency town halls. They weren't about contracts or meal breaks or equipment changes. They were about bias. And the question was no longer, how do we follow protocol? It had become, what do we do when protocol is used as a disguise for prejudice? In a classroom in Atlanta, a teacher wrote 4 words on the board. Are you sure her students understood the reference immediately? One raised her hand and said, that's what the flight attendant said to him. The teacher nodded. And that's what we ask people like him all the time. Are you sure this is your school, your seat, your opportunity? Then she looked around the room. What would happen if instead we asked, how can I support you here? Silence, but not from apathy, from realization. Back at Atlantic Crest's Denver office, Monica Ellis, the director of HR, met with her reform team. Forget modules, she said. They looked confused. No more PowerPoints, no more staged scenarios, no more pre-written apologies, a young manager asked. Then what are we doing? Monica held up her phone. The screen showed Elias sitting silently in seat 2A. We're going to teach our people how to look at someone and see them. In seat 2A, during the return flight to New York, Elias sat quietly once again, but now people looked differently. The man in 2C didn't pull out a financial magazine. The woman in 3A didn't glance and turn away. They didn't stare. They simply nodded. They acknowledged him not as the boy who went viral, but as someone who changed their own silence into something that could be shared. Near the end of the flight, a young flight attendant in training approached Elias with a tray of water. He was nervous. Elias could tell. The young man began. I just want you to know your story's being used in our new onboarding seminar. Elias raised an eyebrow slightly. It's not called diversity training anymore, the attendant added. It's called listening class. Elias smiled, faintly. That's a good start, he said. As the plane began its descent, passengers looked out the windows, their thoughts not on connecting flights or baggage claim, but on the quiet boy who sat and read and made the world listen without saying much at all. The headlines had started to fade, not disappear, just blur into the background hum of the next news cycle. Another scandal, another tweet storm, another viral reckoning. But Elias Monroe's world hadn't quieted. In fact, the silence had only grown heavier, because the world now expected him not just to stand in seat 2A, but to stand for something bigger. Inside a modest glass-paneled meeting room at Carter and Monroe Holdings, Elias sat across from 3 members of Atlantic Crest's Reform Task Force. On the table sat a freshly printed offer letter. Position, Special Ethics and Inclusion Advisor, Compensation Competitive Start Date, Immediate Scope, Flight Training Curriculum Reform, Public Spokesperson, Advisory Board Member. The paper was thick, the header embossed, the tone respectful. But Elias didn't touch it. Not yet. "So," said Monica Ellis gently, "this is yours. If you want it." Elias looked up from the offer. "What if I don't?" Monica folded her hands. "Then we continue the work anyway. But we'd be doing it without the person who inspired the first honest moment we've had in years." A younger man beside her, an HR manager named Devin, added, "You don't have to be a symbol. Elias, you'd have authority, input, a real seat at the table." Elias leaned back, and for a moment, he didn't speak, because that was the question haunting him. Is it still mine if I don't want to become your icon? That night, Elias sat in his small apartment above a bookstore in Harlem, the same one he'd moved into after starting college. Outside, car horns and the occasional burst of laughter drifted up through the cracked window. He held his phone, hundreds of unread texts, dozens of voicemails, but it was one text that made him pause. From his father, Graham Monroe. "You don't have to accept the offer, son, but if you say nothing, someone else will fill that silence, and they may not understand what you do." The next morning, Elias walked into P.S. 211, his old middle school. He had agreed reluctantly to speak to a classroom of 8th graders. He didn't bring notes, didn't wear a suit, didn't arrive with a team, just a worn backpack, his usual black hoodie, and the quiet weight of a story the world had turned into a hashtag. The teacher, Ms. Beckford, introduced him simply. "This is Elias Monroe. Some of you know what happened to him. I'd like you to hear what he thinks about what comes next." Elias stepped forward, dozens of eyes on him. A girl in the front row had her arms crossed defensively. A boy in the back looked down at his shoes. He exhaled, then said, "I didn't ask to be on camera. I didn't ask to go viral. I just sat in a seat with my name on it." He paused, and someone decided I didn't belong there. A student raised his hand. "But now you're, famous. Doesn't that fix it?" Elias smiled gently. "No, it doesn't fix it. It just shows how broken it was to begin with." Another hand. "Are you going to sue them?" "No," Elias said softly. "That would have been easy. Quiet even. But I want something louder. I want them to change how they see everyone else who comes after me." He scanned the room. "And I want you to know you don't need to go viral to matter." Back in the conference room that afternoon, Elias walked in holding a folded sheet of notebook paper. He placed it on the table. Monica Ellis picked it up. It wasn't signed, wasn't formatted, just a sentence, handwritten in blue ink. "I'll join, not as a figurehead, but as a reminder. Don't give me a title. Give me a platform where I can ask the questions no one else will." That evening, Atlantic Crest issued a new press release. Just one paragraph. Elias Monroe has agreed to serve as a lead consultant in reimagining our passenger experience, staff training, and cultural review process. He is not a spokesperson. He is our teacher, and we are here to learn." On his way out of the office that night, Elias passed a janitor mopping the marble floors. The man looked up. "You the kid from that plane?" Elias nodded. The man paused, leaned on his mop handle, and said, "Took a lot of guts to sit back down in that seat. Took more to stay." Elias didn't reply right away. Then he said, "Staying's the part I'm still figuring out." But he would. Not because the apology had fixed everything, but because he had finally decided what his silence would stand for. Not a symbol, not a story, but a start. The gate screen read Flight AC-19, New York to Seattle, first boarding Elias Monroe. The terminal was quiet. Early, the kind of quiet just before the day stretches its arms into noise. A few passengers sipped coffee, some tapped through emails, others simply stared out at the airplane. But when Elias Monroe walked toward the gate, something was different. Not in him. He still wore his worn backpack, still moved with quiet certainty. No entourage, no flash, no media. What was different was how they looked at him now, with awareness, with pause, with respect not for his name but for what he'd made the world remember. The gate attendant, a young woman with locks and round glasses, looked up. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe. Thank you for flying with us today." Elias smiled slightly. "Thanks." She didn't ask to see his ID again, didn't double-check his boarding group. She just scanned his pass and said, "Welcome back to Seat 2A." As he entered the first-class cabin, there were no side eyes, no magazine lifting, no lipstick freezing mid-air, just passengers, and a boy returning to the place he never should have been removed from. Seat 2A was exactly as he remembered it. Window seat, polished armrest, the sunlight gently spilling in across the headrest. But now, it felt different, not just because it was his, but because everyone knew it too. Halfway through boarding, a child walked past first class, clutching his mother's hand. He stopped short, tugged at her coat, and pointed. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the boy from the video." The mother gently smiled at Elias. He nodded, warm but quiet. The boy kept staring. "Is that where it happened?" he asked softly, pointing at the seat. Elias turned toward him and said, "This is where it started." In the rear galley. Layla Stone smoothed down her apron. She wasn't assigned to first class today, but she had requested this flight. She needed to see it. When she stepped into the aisle and caught sight of Elias, she paused. He saw her too. There was no need for a speech, just a shared look that said, "We both know what this flight means." The intercom beeped. The captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight AC-19. Today's flight will be approximately 5 hours and 15 minutes. And today, more than just distance is being traveled. We're proud to be part of a journey that started not with turbulence, but with truth." A few passengers looked up, some nodded, some swallowed hard. Everyone understood. During the meal service, a flight attendant paused by Elias's seat. She was older, with streaks of gray in her bun and a kind steadiness in her voice. "We've added something new to our training," she said softly. "Oh," Elias asked. "Every crew member now spends one full day learning about passenger empathy. It's called the SEAT program." Elias raised an eyebrow. She leaned in slightly. It's built around your story. He didn't respond immediately, then simply asked, "Does it include listening?" She smiled. "It starts with it." At 36,000 feet, Elias pulled a book from his backpack. Not a memoir, not an airline manual, just fiction. He leaned against the window and read. For once, he wasn't being watched. He was simply being. In Seattle, the plane touched down under soft, overcast skies. As passengers stood and reached for bags, several glanced Elias's way not out of curiosity, but with a kind of quiet admiration. Seat 2A wasn't just a seat anymore. It had become a landmark, like Selma, like Stonewall, not in scale but in message. Sometimes all it takes is sitting down to stand up for what matters. As Elias stepped off the plane, a ground agent handed him a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Elias, today, my daughter boarded a flight in a hoodie. She told me she wasn't afraid someone would question her seat anymore. Thank you for making that difference. A parent you've never met." In Atlantic Crest HQ, a new plaque had been installed in the training center. Black steel, silver etching. It read, "Let this seat remind us silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of choice. In honor of Elias Monroe, who chose stillness and changed the air we breathe." That evening, in his Seattle hotel room, Elias stood by the window. The city lights blinked like a distant constellation. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel finished. But he felt whole. And as he sat once more this time in the quiet comfort of a new city, he knew something important. The seat didn't change him. He changed the seat. And, in doing so, he changed the system built around it. He never wanted to be famous. He didn't ask to be the face of a movement. All Elias Monroe wanted was to sit in his seat, read his book, and reach his destination. But when a flight attendant looked at him and saw someone who didn't belong, he lost more than just a seat. He was stripped of dignity in front of a silent crowd. And yet, he didn't respond with rage. He responded with presence, with stillness, and somehow, that silence became louder than any scream. It held up a mirror not just to an airline, but to all of us. How many times have we looked away when something felt uncomfortable? How often do we let silence protect us, instead of protecting what's right? This isn't just a story of one boy and one flight. It's a wake-up call for a world that still judges by appearance more than truth. And maybe next time, when someone's being treated unfairly, we won't ask, "Is this my business?" We'll just stand up, even if we stand alone. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not just for the content, but to keep these conversations alive. Because sometimes it only takes one quiet voice to help us all hear what we've been ignoring. Until next time, keep watching, keep feeling, and keep standing up.